Will I go ahead?
Go.
Go. Okay. Welcome to the third workshop session for our People Powered Places, our practice's second self-initiated annual research project. This project seeks to explore best practice in community participation in planning and housing and enable capacity building within Metropolitan Workshop so that we are better placed to support our clients to meet the needs and aspirations of communities and all building users. My name is Andrea and I'm an architect at Metropolitan Workshop, and along with practice colleagues in Dublin and London studios, I'm a member of the People Power Places focus group, facilitated jointly by Dhruv and Ava. In the coming months, this group will collaborate to prepare a simple set of principles to guide and evaluate our approach to community participation in housing and planning, to be launched in spring 2022. The purpose of today's session is to consider how best to communicate the economic constraints and opportunities of housing and regeneration projects to communities during participation, so that they can be empowered to engage with the design and development process in an informal way. We are delighted to welcome Gemma and Michael, MEAD Fellows for 2019. MEAD Fellowships are awarded to students of the University of the Arts, London, and generally sponsored by Scott Mead, to enable future practitioners to deliver arts projects that demonstrate outstanding ideas in practice. Gemma and Michael used their time as fellows to realise a project entitled Visualising Viability, which sought to demystify property developments to support communities to engage in the management and delivery of their homes. The project consists of a graphic guide to viability, revealing how design and finance are inherently connected, and an interactive game in which participants can examine how different inputs change the proposed outcome. Gemma and Michael have taken insights developed through the fellowship to their housing and community focused practice with the London Community Land Trust, and more recently the innovative developer Town and Enfield Council's strategic planning and design team. Following Gemma's and Michael's presentation, I will present my experiences of the community-led design process between a co-housing group, a design team and a developer within the custom-built Marmalade Lane co-housing scheme in Cambridge when I was part of the practice Mole Architects. I will also present a more recent project with my collaborator Kate Griffin for the Town Ecologies project, which is funded by the Arts Council in Ireland, Kilkenny Leader Project and Kilkenny County Council, which is a project in Ballyragget, County Kilkenny. This is a project where we use different tools, including a physical model, to engage with the community. We will conclude the session with a practice conversation chaired by Dhruv, which will focus on benefits and challenges of communicating cost implications to residents during design, iteration and use. Thanks very much, and over to Gemma and Michael.
Brilliant. I'm just going to share my screen 1 second. Oh, Michael, you might have to share these slides. For some reason, mine's not working.
Just give me a second.
Thank you.
Can everyone see that?
Yeah.
Just the slides, not the other things on my screen.
Just the slides, yeah, that's fine.
All right, great.
Brilliant. Thank you for sorting that, Michael. So,
right.
yeah, hello, I'm Gemma.
And I'm Michael. And yeah, thanks for having us here. We're really excited to share our project, Visualising Viability, with you all this afternoon. I have to make the next slide go.
So Michael and I met at Central St Martin's, where we did our masters in architecture, And we're both interested in planning, housing, viability, and also alternatives to the kind of status quo of housing. So as housing targets and acute need applies pressure to build homes at scale and pace, the efficiencies in design, construction and cost have come to define a pro forma for volume house building. At its worst, housing design can become little more than solving a puzzle of space standards and planning policy. And we really wanted to communicate with people how this kind of has come to be. So in 2019, we were awarded funding from University of the Arts London and the Scott MEAD Fellowship to deliver our workshop and game visualising viability.
Thanks, Gemma. And I guess just, you know, where this has come from, the image you see on the screen now is a workshop I ran as part of my master's project with London Community Land Trust. So this workshop was attempting to kind of demystify the planning process with a group of young people, the Advocacy Academy, who were campaigning to get a site for a community land trust in London, in Lambeth, which they did get in the end. And I guess just a bit of background about me, in 2019, building on that interest in the kind of beyond the wider role of an architect, I joined Enfield Council via public practice, which is an initiative to bring design skills back into the public sector. At Enfield, I work supporting planners, raise the quality of design and plan applications, but also doing kind of early stage work and early stage master plans and policy as well.
And the photo of me on the screen there is a workshop, well, a game that I ran at the Tate Late with the artists Rebecca Davies and Eva Sajovic, also known as the People's Bureau, who've been working around Elephant Castle for a long period of time. And again, as Michael was working with London CLT, I was working with them with this game, which was basically a Jenga style game, a timed Jenga style game to communicate the kind of planning constraints and talk about the regeneration of Elephant Castle. So yeah, that's where I was coming from. I'm a development manager at Town. I've recently joined the team there, so working on a couple of custom build and community led housing projects in Norwich and Newcastle, and previously held a role at Community Led Housing London as a senior project advisor, working with groups across the city to at the early stages of development to basically secure sites and think through the feasibility of those projects, and also worked in architecture practice at housing architecture practices as well. So we all know that housing is emotive. We all have a relationship with where we call home, and most people have opinions on how those homes are afforded, governed, and how they operate. However, it's far too easy to remove this human experience we have with our homes when developers, whether they are public or private, are looking to make a project viable.
So our project is to try and make this dark art of viability accessible to everyone. I think the way we like to think about it is that we can all manage our household finances. So I think questions like how much we get paid, what our monthly expenditure is, mortgage, rent, and how much we need to save a month. And you know, we think that an early stage appraisal isn't that different from that. There's just larger figures and a bit more complicated. So our project is aiming to make a kind of educational board game that will show how viability has spatial consequences, you know, taking inspiration from things like Monopoly or the Landlord's game, which was its precursor. Part of that is a graphic guide to viability, so the instruction manual really. And this can all be presented as a standalone game, but also as a workshop. So it has two functions really. Next slide. So I guess neighbours of new housing developments can often, this is why we're doing it. Neighbours of new housing developments can often feel powerless when they see things like tall buildings coming to their area or homes marketed well beyond the reach of local people. I think most people are questioning the way our cities built, being made and governed. Gemma?
So yeah, questions you might hear at consultation are some of these on the screen. So, but also, you know, why does everything kind of look the same? Why does it have to be so tall? Why can't we have essential infrastructure such as a new nursery, and why is there such little affordable housing? And consultation events in themselves often ask people about perhaps the design. I've been to consultation events where it was focusing on the landscaping of the scheme, but rarely do they really touch on the fundamentals, which are these questions, and that can become quite frustrating, I think, for people to fully engage with that process.
Yeah, so we think that being able to scrutinise the inputs of a viability model will expose how these developments come to be, and I guess how the rising cost of land, construction and finance is leading to a lot of the changes in our cities these days, as well as property prices.
And kind of a lack of this viability modelling isn't necessarily restricted to just the general public. We have a quote here from Guardian journalist Ollie Wainwright in 2015, that viability assessments and the dark arts of accounting have become all-powerful tools in the way that our cities are being shaped. So viability is being used to justify perhaps some decisions that have been made in modern development, and that's kind of inaccessible. This idea that it's a black box, so essentially, you go to a consultation event, all the inputs go in and things come out, but no one really understands fully what happens in between. So, you might hear, oh, well, you can't have this because it's not viable. Why? And it's the reason why we are seeing, taller buildings, value engineering, material quality lowered, and maybe council homes being demolished and then not replaced.
And I think there's a kind of wider question, a wider context, which is, does perhaps maybe not all MEAD workshops work is in this realm, but does the cross-subsidy model work of using development to pay for social infrastructure and public goods? And I guess the further question is just how much do people actually understand development-led city making? So I guess just on the screen now we're showing we're just showing an open source spreadsheet available to community groups and community land trusts, but I think it just illustrates the complexity of these viability models. So a very complicated spreadsheet essentially. We think they can seem, the numbers and the appearance of them can seem complex, but we believe that the relationships between different factors can be easily explained.
And so the idea for our game came from, if I was to explain the rules of Monopoly on this call just by talking about them, you may not understand how all the interrelationships work. But once you've played it once or twice, you can then start to think about what those interrelationships are. And this game that we have on the screen is actually called the Landlord's Game from 1904. It was invented by Elizabeth Maggie, and it was to teach Georgism. So this game was designed to criticise the exploitative nature of landlords and rent extraction. And actually, this game was then taken by Parker Morris and developed into Monopoly. But the original version was to talk about the value of land and landlord rent extraction. So Georgism is the economic ideology that while people should own the value of what they produce themselves, the economic value derived from land should be a shared asset, and that land and natural resources should be publicly owned.
So just now we're just going to run briefly through the basics of a kind of simplified appraisal that the principles of which we've used to underpin our game. There's something missing there.
Maybe just go to the next slide.
Yep. Oh, here we are.
Yeah, so it's the idea that the cost of development, so the construction cost, professional fees, surveys, legals, abnormalities, has to be equal to income, essentially. So that's just shown here on those scales. So just to go step by step, the first aspect is obviously your income. So this is generally your receipt from selling the homes, or any capital value from the rental, and income must equal your spend for the scheme to be viable. On the other side is the spend, made up of several components. So you have the cost of the land, you have the construction costs, and construction quality is a cost. You have your planning obligations, such as affordable housing provision. As affordable housing doesn't really generate high returns, sometimes their construction costs can actually outweigh their capital values. But also in planning obligations, you have your Section 106, social infrastructure. And then at the bottom there, you have profits, which is typically set at 15 to 20%. And I think this is one of the key things that we want to talk about in this game, because essentially this profit and how much there is it's whether it's a profit for shareholders, whether it's for reinvesting in a business, or is it also, if you are a new community group looking to do a project, it's actually the contingency level, or what you need to reinvest into your new community organisation. So I think to call it profit and to really get into what that is in there for is one of the reasons we want to develop this game. And so this scenario shows a second developer on the same site where the land cost has been raised, and all the other costs need to be squeezed, or the sales value needs to rise.
Sorry,
the lower
I'm still seeing the previous income equals spend slide at the moment. I don't know if anyone else has got the same.
Are you seeing a difference now? So that it's the same. It should have changed somewhat. I've changed it.
Hi, Michael. We can see the difference. Basically, the land value is changing, and the other aspects are being forced to become more economical.
I'm not paying attention.
That's okay. So the participants of the game will have to manage both the cost and income of the scheme on their board to make sure that the scheme is viable, and we'll run through that gameplay later on.
I think this really highlights another element we want to communicate in the game, which is between the two examples you've got. We're basically showing that there are multiple things at play. So things like construction quality can be reduced, or planning obligations reduced, but also the number of homes increased, and it's how the kind of push and pull of viability and the trade-offs between those things. Next slide. So we are going to take you through our first prototype of this game, which happened in the before times in 2019. So this was part of an event in Stoke-on-Trent, which was put on by the AN Network, which is the Artist Information Company. So they are a artist membership organisation, over 24,000 members, and we were there as part of a programme led by Anna Francis and Rebecca Davies from Portland In Project, which is a kind of community-led scheme in Stoke. The event was held in a shipping container on the Portland In estate, and was part of a wider series of workshops and artist workshops about kind of the environment, housing, sustainable practice. The reason we went to this event was, first of all, to prototype some ideas and trial the game with an audience of open-minded people who are interested in the subject but not necessarily experts. We also didn't want to be bringing a prototype of this game to a community perhaps subject to development or part of a development without having thoroughly tested it. And as well as that, just testing the practicalities of our game as it stood at that point. So how it worked was we had two boards set up for the opposing teams. On each side, basically on each site, it was the same site models with terraced housing, a little park. This was to simulate, and each team had the same board. This was to simulate two developers and two design teams appraising and designing a site, so in competition with each other. Each board was placed on top of a flatbed scale, so a digital scale that weighed the blocks and gave a residual land value. The pieces were all 1 to 50 scaled and weighted by their value. So for instance, market sale blocks were weighted by their profit. So a 1-bed 2-person weighed a bit more than a 3-bed 4-person. So you're basically trying to communicate through the weight the relative value of each thing. So we had a few rounds of this. So the first round, it was called Beat the Bidder. We projected on the screen a value that people had to meet within 5 minutes. So essentially, this was about warming up the players and understanding how the game worked. But essentially, people were trying to get a land value on the screen. So people were creating whatever they wanted, often quite large pyramids or other towers. But the idea was, you've got the most freedom, and you're trying to get just to get the land value. On the second iteration, we brought in some constraints. So things like planning rules, rules about height, some very rough rules about affordability. So we brought in some affordable units as well, which were, instead of weighted blocks, were hollow blocks of cards, so that they were basically didn't add up to the land value. And what happened was we ended up with essentially everyone ended up with a kind of cube of development that was the same. So what happened was people started off with different schemes that maybe had features that they might have wanted, like a more open space or dual aspect, and we ended up with 2 schemes that were basically the same.
Yeah, and this second round, which we called kind of have your cake, as in have your cake and eat it, was we took away that land value and really opened up the room to talk about the kinds of developments that the kind of development that people want to see. And so that by removing that land cost, they were able to build family housing, affordable housing, and basically exploring what kind of scheme can you build when there isn't a land cost. And that comes from both Michael and my experience with working in community land trusts, who are able to secure sites at a subsidised rate. So we really, at this point, we're talking about what the effect of land value has on the project.
Yep, and I think what we introduced as the final stage was chance cards. So the idea of these are to simulate the kind of contingencies and abnormalities and things that come up during any development process. So these were to communicate, I guess, the negotiation that happens through a project and having to deal with things that are out of your control, but you still have to deal with them to deliver your project. So some of these, for instance, where the council wants more money for their land, so you have to build more houses to manage to get that. Or perhaps there's helpful ones like the planners are happier for you to go up an extra story. And I think what this made people think about was they've designed their kind of dream scheme, which is the have your cake and eat it, but then they have to figure out how to negotiate around it. What do we actually want? Do we want more affordable, or do we want the community centre? And think about how they would communicate that with the community or amongst their own group if they were a community group. And I think that is quite a important thing for, I think, people to understand, both in the community but also in the professional world as well.
And I think this is also where the what we were discussing earlier with the profit line in the whichever way you want to talk about it, whether it's return or profit, that contingency, that cost that is so often perhaps sometimes pointed to as, well, we're not looking to make a profit, so we can do this, or we're not. It's more that the return is lower, perhaps, or you set that return and you have the agency to do that. But those chance cards you could only really respond to them if you had built up that profit and you were able to basically cover what those development risks were.
And I think overall it was I think what this workshop did for us was demonstrate that people can engage with the concepts quite readily. So once people got warmed up, they picked it up, and understood what some of the relationships were. The weighted version, so you can see the scale in action there, was very intuitive, and it's something that we'd like to develop for a future workshop perhaps. And that I think people, there is a demand for it. People are really interested in conversation. We're flowing. Yeah, and I think it doesn't, you know, there are workshops on design of the building, about the massing or the design of flats, but not really one that talks about financial viability of this. So we weren't asking people to design a building that actually worked, as you can probably tell from the blocks.
And as we all know, COVID-19 has made us all have to adapt to how we kind of living or working. And so, but it really did present a challenge to us. So obviously this is funded from the MEAD Fellowship. And the whole idea was that we would be going out and doing these workshops with community groups that we both know. And that obviously that wasn't possible. So the kind of next iteration that we were looking at following from that feedback is actually a board game version of it. So something that we can develop, and it can be posted, and people don't need to be, you know, myself and Michael perhaps don't need to be present. So but that feedback from Stoke was so useful for the next design of this. And it's not to say that we wouldn't love to go out and do more workshops, and I'm sure we will. But the point that we're where we are at the moment is to develop a product that is a build game.
Yeah, and I think this little diagram just kind of shows you the direction we're going in. So it's the idea is that it would be much like Monopoly or the landlord's game, its predecessor. You would have a box with a kind of beautifully designed board game inside it. We've introduced the idea of characters, so you know, there's the developer, architect, surveyor, the planner, and these are to help divide up the work of the game, but also, you know, bring in that negotiation element. So the developer might be the protagonist in the game, so the one pushing it forward, but they have to interact with the architect, the surveyor who's the banker, and the planner who is the one making sure that the obligations they have to meet are met, and that some but also provide a bit of negotiation when inevitably those can't all be met. We're looking at doing different board games, different sites. So you could see it as easier sites or harder sites, or ones that present different constraints and challenges. And for the board game, using more of a money system rather than a scale system. And finally, the kind of instruction manual will tell you the rules, but also become a bit of a gateway for learning more about viability in a more detailed way, or signposting people towards resources.
So yeah, you can see here in a sneak peek that we are, well, we've got to a working version now that we're quite happy with, but as you might see, it's not presented the way that we'd like it to be presented. So the next stage of design for us is to really we have the mechanics of it working. It's to package it up now, so it's ready for production essentially. And we're hoping that this will be done early next year.
Yeah, and yeah, thank you very much for having us today. And if you want to get in touch, feel free to come to our landing page and yeah, get in touch. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thanks, Gemma. If we can have a handover, I've got loads of questions, so hopefully there'll be time to ask them. Andrea, so if you can stop sharing, Michael, and Andrea can share. Move on to our next presentation. Thank you.
Can everyone see that?
It's currently black.
Oh. Stop and I'll start again. Can everyone see that?
No, it's just don't worry, Andrew. We'll work it out. It's just basically your icon. Yeah, we can now. Brilliant.
Okay, Perfect. Okay, so I'm just going to run through 2 projects that I was involved in that involved an element of community-led, community-led housing, and then kind of community engagement as well. And the first project I'm going to present is it's Marmalade Lane, which is a co-housing project. Maybe a few people may have kind of referenced it in kind of precedent studies and everything like that. But this was done by Mole Architects, and it was essentially a co-housing project at the edge of Cambridge with 42 homes. This was the co-housing group. They were actually a group that formed almost 10 years previous, I think. So the difficulty that they had was finding a site. So they had kind of done initial studies of what they kind of wanted, and they had kind of come up with this brief that I suppose the best way for them to deliver the project was in a kind of a developer-led model. This was also facilitated by a quite forward-thinking council. So Cambridge City Council, together with South Cambs Council, which is where this site was eventually kind of where the site was located, they kind of collaborated, and the site that was there initially was identified for private development. But obviously the kind of the forward-thinking people in the council that recognised the importance of community-led housing said, well, there's a group here, and this is the perfect site for them. So this was kind of a mix of different people. So it's a diverse range. You've got young families, you've got older people that are looking to kind of move out of larger homes into kind of more smaller homes. You've got single people. So it's a real diverse kind of group, but I suppose what they have in common was a kind of open-minded approach to their housing solution, and to kind of live in a kind of neighbourly way. So it's an intentional community. So these people come together as a group, and then from that, that their neighbourhood is almost formed. The links are formed before they move in. So this is the group together with the co-housing group, ourselves, who were the architects, the design team, and the developers. So essentially we got involved, and there was a competition held which was really well organised with the council for a developer design team kind of group. So that competition involved an element of design, and then together with the council and the co-housing group, it was decided that who would take that competition forward and who eventually won. So I mean, we were quite new to co-housing. There's very few co-housing. I think there's about 10 in the UK, but this was the first developer-led co-housing model in the UK. So with that, there were a lot of firsts. But I suppose, as a team, we kind of formed different ways of working, and together with the council as well, they had a very kind of innovative approach in terms of the land. So this land, I think, from the sale of each of the individual houses, so each person owns their individual house. With the sale of the houses, I think then the developer town was able to kind of pay back incrementally based on when at the time of the sale, as opposed to paying outright for a piece of land. So there was kind of a different model presented there, which kind of enabled the whole project. I'll just move on. So essentially the scheme is 42 homes. Obviously there's a diverse group, there needs to be a diverse typology. What we can see here is a row of terrace houses that have their gable, it's a standard kind of house type, but within that you've got 2 to 5 bedroom homes within these plots, and they all have the same front to back width, the same with these and the same with these. The only difference, I suppose, between these terraces here and this terrace here is the gables. So there's express gables here to allow kind of the PV panels on the roof to kind of work for the southerly aspect. So they're the kind of larger homes. Then that's kind of divided by a central lane, which is known as Marmalade Lane, which the scheme gets its name. And then in the centre of it is the common house with the common garden towards the back. And then there's an apartment block here with kind of 1 to 2 bedroom homes. There's also guest bedrooms incorporated into the common house as well. So that's kind of the scheme. There was an existing kind of series of trees on the site, and we had conversations with the co-housing group on whether to keep those, and we decided that we would keep those. And you'll see in later images that was really valuable because it kind of gave the place a very lived-in feel right from the beginning. Just to say, I was involved in the project from that early competition stage, and then I left the project just as it was about to go on site. This is kind of, I took this from the town website, so it's kind of interesting in terms of how, the co-housing group, the choices that they had. So there was a custom build element to this. So essentially they could choose their plot, so they could decide whether they wanted to live on the lane or live kind of on a house, overlooking the common garden. Then they could choose the shell. So there was kind of, in terms of the houses, there was 3 different kind of shells, and within that you could configure the interior. So that house could go from a 2-bedroom to a 5-bedroom house, depending on the layout configuration. The other option was an interior finishes. So there was for internal wall finishes for kitchens and bathrooms, different types of tiling finishes, colour finishes, standard of kitchen unit finishes. That was all a customised finish that the co-housing group could choose from. The other kind of interesting one was external options. So I think there was a palette of, I think there was 4 different brick types that the people that lived in the houses could choose from. And that was an interesting one because actually I don't think that was chosen until after planning. And there was a really interesting kind of negotiation with the planners in terms of giving them certainty in terms of basically enabling them to envision that any configuration possible would work in terms of planning. And then obviously there was the purchase of the homes. So this is kind of an early site plan. You can see kind of the different, the kind of beige or the A type, they're slightly narrower, the B type are wider. And then you've got these kind of, we call them Tyneside flats. So, you've got a single 1-bed apartment on the ground floor, and then you have a walk up, it can be a 2-story, 2-bed apartment on the upper floors. And then you've got your apartments over on this side, and then the common house. The main strategy in terms of the site plan from the very, very beginning, and it was a wish of the co-housing group, was that all of the car parking was kept to the minimum and kept kind of out of sight, and that this lane, which is open to the public, but it's only used for kind of emergency access or drop off, and that the main kind of majority of the car parking is to the rear. We had a number of different subgroups, so how we managed it in terms of consulting the co-housing group. We had actually an initial consultant who came in for the early stage kind of consultations, but essentially what we had was a series of subgroups dedicated to each kind of the main elements of the design. So we had one kind of focus on the houses, the sustainability, the kind of M&E strategy, which was really important to the group. And we had another group based just specifically just for the common house, and then another for the common garden. So what this produced was a series of, I would say, about 4 or 5 people within the co-housing community dedicated to these individual, parts of the design. And then through them, we would come up with options for them in terms as the design developed between that early stage when we won the competition up until planning, and then right through we even furthered the conversation right to tender. Those subgroups would then go back to the main group of the co-housing residents, and they would kind of disseminate those options. And then they would come back, and that was how the decision-making process worked. What it made really clear to us at that point was that because we have 42 householders, we have to simplify the process in some ways. There's a lot of decisions to be made. So the simplicity of the layout, but also the different options and the range of options within that you know, that was something that we worked on all the way through and kind of tried to master. But I think that's the key to kind of a customized approach. But it was a really, really interesting process. And, you know, out of those discussions, you know, we have this parking arrangement, and we actually ended up putting car parking, I think, towards the south, which was a requirement from the council in terms of their parking ratios. The co-housing group pushed back on this and said, actually, we don't have that many cars. And they were installed anyway. The council kind of persisted, but in actual fact, they've been removed. So those car parking spaces that were required were removed, and that's, I think there's a trampoline and chickens kind of roaming around this area. So it's just those interesting kind of conversations that we have in terms of, you know, what the regulations say, but also what the groups say that they actually need. The other interesting thing is, I suppose, the aspect of front to back. So the arrangement of this is that people's front doors are facing the street to Orchard Park. There's housing all around this area, and these all face the street, and then they back onto the common garden. But obviously the backs of these face onto kind of the laneway, and then the fronts. So it's a kind of a back to front configuration. And how we dealt with that lane and the width of that lane, and then the kind of portion of private space that each individual home had, was kind of a negotiation that was ongoing. What we eventually kind of came up with, and it was through the kind of foresight of the co-housing group, was that they kind of conceded that, you know, these rear gardens could get shorter. Because they had the benefit of this common garden space, which was owned by the whole community, and the same with regards to the lane. So there was a huge kind of compromise and decision-making process there that was really worthwhile. And obviously, you know, when something hasn't been done before, and you're kind of thinking, will this work? As designers, we're thinking, but when we look at the images and, you know, when we go back to the site, you can kind of see how well that lane works in terms of, and that's due to the foresight of the community. I mean, Secure by Design would also kind of say that, you know, everyone's back garden has to be enclosed, and there's also kind of overlooking issues as well that the regulations tell us. But in actual fact, because we had a client on board already, a client group, then they were able to say, well, actually, that doesn't really matter to me. I don't mind that there's a low wall to my back garden and people can see in to my kitchen window. That's okay. I'm okay with that. And they're also okay with the fact that people can just wander in off the street and come around, and actually there's no gate. There may be a gate now because they have hens, but they were fine in terms of, you know, coming in and wandering into this common garden. Even, and most surprising, you know, we would have had discussions with, you know, the different groups, and, you know, I was kind of surprised that one of the members of the common garden group, you know, she had children, young children herself, and she said, listen, I just want them to roam free, and that there's certain boundaries that, you know, that you don't pass naturally, and it doesn't need to be that there's a gate there all the time. So that's kind of the kind of site plan. I'll just go through. So that's kind of early images of, you know, renders of how we envisage the kind of back gardens leading on to the lane, and then these small front gardens as well. And this is what the common garden looks like now. So those existing trees that remained, you know, you can see that they really enliven the space, and then it's heavily occupied. So, you know, this, I think they only moved in 2018. So this is the kind of signs of occupation are there. And we can only kind of put that down to the fact that these people were speaking to each other, you know, for some people were speaking to each other for 10 years, if not more. I suppose the other thing to say is that this isn't a commune. People bought their individual homes. Some people live quite individually. It's just to have a kind of a neighborliness is kind of the main thing. Obviously, some people, you know, they eat together, they can share tools. There's a common laundry facilities, there's a shop. But the overall concept is that, you know, that each individual person has their own kitchen and their own house, and that if they do feel like, you know, joining in on community events, then they're more than welcome to do so. This is the common house. So there was a dedicated group in terms of how they would organise the space in here, you know, what kind of events they would have, you know, whether they would have big, you know, a big long dining table where everyone sits together, or, you know, smaller closed off spaces. So that was just one of the really interesting discussions that we had. So back to the homes then, and that idea that, you know, the layouts have to be as flexible as possible. So there's an awful lot of work spent, and I think that that's one of the things, you know, there's an awful lot of work spent preparing for, you know, you've got a lot of different kind of client subgroups, and also the developer, who's town and Swedish timber frame manufacturer. So, you know, there's a lot of different elements to this, and also, so in terms of simplicity, the construction has to be simple. How you communicate that to the co-housing group has to be really, really clear. So all of these elements, it takes time, but I think the end result is kind of worth it. Obviously, there's kind of inefficiencies associated with doing anything for the first time. So essentially, each individual home has the same, a similar ground floor configuration. So this is an A type, which are up here, and then a B type. They're kind of interspersed in all of the throughout the plan, actually. And then these are a D type apartment, which are kind of over here, which are very similar to kind of a standard apartment scheme. There were two options within this type, and then there's an E type, which is a slightly different kind of quirky kind of plan. So the main difference is that obviously, like, we were introducing kind of a partition that kind of at first floor level. That was one option for the narrow types, and then you also had an option for an attic conversion. The two attic conversions involved a dormer, and then there was also an option where you could have an ensuite or not. Within that, in the gable configuration, then it was just a knockout panel. So you'll see in some of the images that there's a knockout panel in one of the gable elevations. So the design team would have been presented with these options. Well, not the design team, the co-housing group. So, and then these were fed back to they kind of made decisions on what options they would then bring forward to the overall group. So the other thing is just to mention that we were the developer was a kind of collaboration between Town, who Gemma now works for, and a Swedish timber frame manufacturer. So it's kind of like high energy windows with a kind of in a timber frame and in a prefabricated system. So this was kind of specified well in advance of tender, but also we also had an element of CLT on the scheme. So this is the group, and they seem like they are pretty happy with the whole thing. I have yet to come back, so I don't know for sure, but I need to get flights booked, and I can't wait to see it. I'll just skip forward to the Town Ecologies project, which was done with the Workhouse Union in collaboration with Kate Griffin, who's a collaborator of mine, and this was funded by the Arts Council and the Kilkenny Leader Project and Kilkenny County Council. So I'll just quickly go through. We decided in terms of this was to look at town ecology as kind of like studying the town and also its environs. So we kind of decided to make an A0 model of the town to facilitate 4 community engagement workshops. So essentially we were looking at the so we kind of made this model out of cork, timber, and balsa wood. So it was quite a sketchy model. 1:1,250 actually at A0, so quite a large scale. But we wanted to get the GA pitch in, and we also wanted to get the town centre in. So this was kind of our enterprising group. And then we were looking, this is kind of, it's got a funny grain. It's a very small town, 1,000 people, and we managed to get 5% of the population engaged. Drew's about to tell me that my time is run out.
I am, yes, I am. I'm sorry. They're both fascinating projects, but I think we need to give people a little chance to ask questions. And sure. I don't know how much time Gemma and Michael have. Is it possible to add a additional 5 minutes to the time we booked you for, or are you busy? Do you have to? Is that all right?
No, 5 minutes is fine.
Brilliant. Okay. That's excellent. So, Andrea, if you had one more thing you wanted to say about your project,
yep.
The last project, say it now.
Okay.
And then we'll move on to the discussion.
Okay, so essentially we had 4 different community engagement workshops, and you can all see what we had here. We had a historic kind of a heritage timeline, and then a keep change board. We had lots of different members of the community, absolutely rattling through it. We had an Instagram page, and then out of that we kind of used the model as a method of communicating our ideas to the council. And then we've identified 3 areas: the River Park, and the bridges. So we were using the model all the time to kind of come up with solutions. So we're not yet finished. So it's probably okay to conclude here, because essentially what we're using is, we use the model as a method for engagement, but also as a method of communication, and we hope that it will form some sort of town plan in the future.
Brilliant. So I'm going to ask the first question, and then Ava's going to encourage people to type in the chat. Both of those projects bring a degree of, so the project you've just ended with in Kilkenny and the game actually invite participants to manage physical items, to basically either plan spatially outcomes or to plan financial outcomes. And what I was struck by with the game, Gemma and Michael's game, was the fact that you were weighing things, which was really interesting, because it was like a set of scales. But the little challenge I might give, and you can tell me I'm dead wrong if you like, but you were also talking about public good. Now that's a really abstract concept, and it's quite hard to weigh or imagine. So I completely get the game was about acclimatizing people to think of the factors involved, but does it have any weaknesses in terms of thinking about those more abstract things? So like public planning and public good doesn't necessarily fit into a weight or an economic model.
Yeah, and I think if you're touching on kind of social value there and how you actually put an economic value to that, I mean, I have my own personal views around that. It's a very difficult thing to put a capital value to, those things that we really, what we do value. But I guess our game doesn't deal with that so much. I think we're only looking at the kind of constraints of, and especially with housing as well. What we're looking at is housing in our game. I think the way that viability appraisals are going is they are starting to potentially look at the economic value of things that developments can provide. I don't think our game does really do that. I think hopefully what we're trying to do is introduce the concept of viability and the inputs that go in, and then that facilitates a conversation afterwards, I think. So
because it's almost like, you would imagine a scenario where you played the game several times and somebody said, oh, hang on, the rules in the packet don't necessarily deal with either the level of sophistication, because of the fine-grained stuff that Andrea was talking about in terms of making decisions as a community, but it might actually raise people's awareness about what they can't capture in the viability model. And when you were talking, I was thinking that was dead powerful, actually.
Yeah, and I think we had to, first of all, we had to strip a lot out. So we're both from architecture practice, and we were thinking about all different unit types you could possibly have, but we've boiled it down to 6. So and the something we will be introducing is the blocks such as, say, a community centre or a nursery. Say the group wanted to have that in their scheme, that wouldn't have a weight to it, but there is an opportunity cost, because spatially, so we should say that the planning rules set out how high you can go, and it sets out, say, the developable envelope. If you're then putting in a community centre or a nursery and it's not really weighed like a market sale flat is, well, then that's a spatial opportunity cost, and we can start to have those sorts of conversations as well.
And I was wondering, Michael, I'm going to hog this unless anybody comes in and asks a question, and it'll be very kind of dry academic conversation. But I was also thinking about, you played the game because you're modifying, you're basically piloting it and you're refining it. Have you thought about, so when I was working on the client side, the worst possible moment was when you went to meet a user group or a residence group, and you'd promised them X, Y, and Z, but then you'd gone back to the QS, and the QS had said, oh no, you really can't afford that potentially in this phase, etc., etc. Does the game take into account change? Because you started off from a position where you said it was like producing a budget. In what way would the game facilitate a community to understand change happens?
So in the maybe not, we're still developing those mechanisms, but in the kind of final board game, there will be an element of, the game only lasts a certain amount of time, and there will be costs added as you go. And as kind of we experimented with the chance cards in the workshop. That's to kind of represent that idea that you might get a chance card that says, in that initial iteration, it could say the surveyor comes back, says the price of materials has doubled, you have to find more money. So that's how we're managing that kind of the contingencies in every project, really.
And right, that's right. And I was thinking as well, in Andrea's project on the mole scheme, you were kind of up close and very kind of person to the decisions people were making around, like, kind of the financial decisions around choice. And I guess Gemma and Michael's, it's deliberately high level because you're trying to train people to think in a particular way. And I suppose, Andrea, how did you were talking about simplicity before, and I'm just wondering, the game has to be fairly simple to teach people the rules. How did you manage choice, and was there any game playing, kind of helpful game playing, when you were testing ideas with the project at Marmalade Lane?
Yeah, I would say that we probably, it was very experimental at the time, and I think when we went and we got everyone's choices back, so we kind of gave an element of choice. But I suppose the conversations that we had with the subgroup were really helpful, because they could then go back and explain why certain decisions were made. It wasn't coming, that there was this kind of, a small group of people and they understood it, and then they could go back and kind of communicate that to the group. So I think that was really, really valuable. I suppose the other thing about simplicity, that we had a lot of different layout options, and we could have really boiled them down. We could have got fewer. And I remember there was one choice. A guy chose. There was only one person that chose like a dormer terrace, and I was kind of like, oh my god, we're going to have to detail this now. And I really wanted someone to go back, but so there was an element of that if there probably should be rules that if X amount of people only choose this amount of this option, then you have to reconsider it.
Well, I'm just thinking, because the game's almost it's scenario playing, isn't it? It's a simulation. But I'm wondering, when you were doing the pilot, did anybody say the rules of this game are not fair and we don't want to play it this way? and I suppose, what did you learn anything? Because basically that is what always happens. Nobody likes playing the rules as they're set out. But what did people say wasn't fair?
I think when we got to what Michael was talking about, that cube, so we had so that iteration had the two teams playing against each other, and we had it timed like in a real life bidding on a site scenario. And I think when they realised that they had both come up with the same cube with loads of one beds in there, that's when they were like, this isn't fair. But it was also communicating, I think, developments that were, there was a recent development in the middle of Stoke-on-Trent, and we would then it opened up conversations of things that were happening nearby. And I think then by removing that land value, that's when we got into some of those other conversations that you were talking about then around social value, because we'd taken the land value out.
Ava, do you want to interrupt and start?
Yes, I think we have a couple of, a question and a comment. Tom, would you like to ask it yourself, or would you like me to read it out?
Yeah, I'm happy to ask it myself, and I apologise if you might have answered it already and I just missed it. But was the game that you tested with residents, so was it in the context of a specific project that they were engaged in?
So when we tested it, we deliberately went with the Artists Information Networks festival, so that we would have a group of people who could be engaged but weren't involved with a particular project. So we didn't want to come with an early prototype to a group of residents who were already, part of or subject to development. So we kind of wanted like a little safe zone to test it in, really. But, yeah. And I think the next part of your question is, do you see it being rolled out more widely? And I guess we're going to get to final soon. and then I guess we'll see. But, yeah, hopefully.
Yeah, I think it's our expectation that we would be, because we've now developed a product more than the workshop as well. Hopefully, it can, be shipped out to different projects and work with residents. That's what we both do normally. So,
I mean, I suppose from our own experience, we've got one kind of main project where we have taken a residents engagement panel and kind of trained them in basic principles of urban design and master planning. And that did include a facet of viability as well, but we didn't have anything like as sophisticated kind of methods as you both have clearly here. But nonetheless, it took us a couple of years to win their trust completely. But when a viability issue raised its head, literally a few months before we went into planning, we went back to the residents to explain that we needed to add 1 to 2 stories on top of some particular buildings in order to, make the development economics stack up. And thankfully, in that instance, they unanimously voted to tell us to get on with it. Because we'd taken the time historically to explain to them, how development economics work, just in the very most basic way, and not as sophisticated as your game does. So I think it's a fantastic initiative, and hopefully it's a tool that we can all use in the future at some point to illustrate the point.
We have another comment from Denise. Denise, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, sorry, it's more of a statement, just trying to think about where the usefulness comes, because I think it's a really engaging tool potentially, but like some of the others have said, I think it's about enabling the discussion and debunking some of those myths and forcing people to be more clear and not to be hiding behind viability strategies. And I know I've seen work done, I don't know if it was Summer Leighton Road, where there were viability issues shared, whichever client that was in London that was sharing the costs with the public, and treating them like proper grown-ups. They can understand, like you said at the beginning, their household budgets. So why can't they understand that of course there isn't enough money? And I think that's a huge reservation from clients on the public and private sector here, that people, it's like, oh, people think that we can have everything, like a swimming pool and a this and a that. And it's like, no, people understand that money is limited. And I mean, the news tells us every day that public money is limited, and essentially it is our money in the end of the day. So they should be given some more clarity on what can be afforded. And I think people should be trusted to be able to make those decisions. And I think on projects we've worked on in the past, whether it's Westbury or this other one, I'm not really sure which one it is, but I've seen the slides. People were shown to be grown up about it and not completely unrealistic about what was achievable. I don't know, to turn that into a question, have you experience of using this or some form of this with residents and showing that they can respond positively to constraints around money, I suppose? Thanks.
I can comment on Michael if you want to chip in, but so yeah, we haven't expressly used this game with a group of residents yet, and as Michael was saying, that was a deliberate decision. Really, we didn't want to go in there. It's a bit of an ethical question whether we go in there with something and test it out with residents, especially if it's quite political, the development near them and things like that. So we really wanted to make sure that the first time, and we're yet to do it, but the first time we go out there, we know that what we're doing is all working. And yeah, I guess we've both had experience of working with community groups and being quite upfront about the costs of projects and the constraints. So with this game is perhaps not getting into the nitty gritty, which was what Andrea was presenting, at Marmalade Lane. It's, you could imagine this on a master plan or a large scale regen scheme or something like that, and it really to bring people around and establish what those principles are at the beginning. And as Tim was saying, you can then refer back to them as you go on and build that complexity. But it's meant to facilitate conversation and introduce the fundamentals.
I'm going to wrap it up now. I normally sum up, but I think we maybe don't have the time for that in this instance. What I would say is I think the game's fantastic, and I think the decisions you're making around piloting and also the ethical decisions about when you actually test is exactly right. I think you're doing exactly the right thing. The one avenue I was thinking about was I actually think architects would probably learn quite a lot from playing this game, because it's bizarre. Very, very experienced architects are often quite worried about getting involved in the game. And the last thing I was going to say about the contingencies, where sometimes the contingencies are really positive. Like you might find that you've suddenly win support from, you know, a women's group aligned to the value. So I was going to say, please, the play would be in the iteration, please include some positive contingencies. And I think, Andrea, we're definitely going to have you back to talk about the next, you know, the next phase of the project you're doing. And I know other members of the practice are undertaking similar work, so that wasn't the last chance. It was great to hear about Marmalade Lane. So thank you very much. I'll be in touch offline, but that was wonderful. It was certainly was what I hoped for. Ava, do you want to say anything before we sign off?
Just to thank you all for joining us. Really, I don't want to. Yeah, I think we have to end now. But yeah, thanks everyone for the discussion and presentations.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you for inviting us.
Gemma. Bye,
Thank you for
Andrea.
having us.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Bye.